years, Russia has carried the war deep inside the Ukrainian territory. But now Ukraine is increasingly showing that it can strike back and strike close to the heart of Russia itself. In a dramatic development, all four major airports serving Moscow were shut down after a massive Ukrainian drone attack triggered an air alert over Russian capital. According to Russian authorities, nearly 60 drones targeting Moscow were intercepted overnight, while Russia's defense ministry claimed that more than 300 Ukrainian drones were shot across the country. The attack forced flight suspension in all four airports. The latest strike comes just days after Ukrainian drones reportedly targeted Moscow's key oil refinery, one of the most important fuel suppliers for the capital region. Taken together, these attacks point to a clear Ukrainian strategy, expanding the battlefield beyond the front line and targeting critical Russian infrastructure hundreds of kilometers from the war zone. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can reach Moscow. The question is how often it can do so, how low-cost drones become Kyiv's most effective weapon against military superior Russia, and are repeated attacks exposing gaps in Russia's air defense shield around its most important city. So while Moscow's airports may have reopened, the message from the Kyiv appears unmistakable. If Russia can strike Ukrainian cities, Ukraine is determined to show that the Moscow is no longer beyond the reach. The big question is Ukraine unsuccessfully bringing the war to the Russian heartland. Will it lead to a massive response from Russia, or will this quagmire will continue? On this issue, I am joined by Professor Swaran Singh from JNU and Adya Madhavan, research analyst from Takshashila Institution. Let me straight away go to Professor Swaran Singh. Sir, my question is, the fight between the Russians and the Ukrainians have escalated, and Ukrainians are hitting deep inside what is sensitive to Russia, St. Petersburg, Moscow. How do you interpret this? I know this is a battlefield issue, but it all boils down to political outcomes.
Absolutely, Karthikeya. I have heard you often mention that Ukraine war now is longer than the First World War. A constant stalemate where on the front lines neither side is winning or losing beyond what happened in initial stages. I think it's in desperation trying to now impact the morale or endurance of each other. And the fact that those cheap drones and more precision missiles are now available to both sides. So they are no longer looking for making gains in terms of frontline territories where soldiers, the cost of soldiers dying and other ammunition, etc., is much more compared to gains on the ground. As I said, on the front line, there is a stalemate. So effort now is to hit on logistics, on energy stations or airports, as you mentioned, or even civilian targets to create that kind of a panic of millions of people who become uncertain when Moscow's airports have to be closed even for a brief period of time. So it's a shift from territorial gains to the sort of strategic national endurance in fighting war, which is a transition in that sense of a new strategy, where both sides are trying to see whether this constant diplomatic uncertainty or military stalemate can find any breakthrough. This could also be in terms of summer being a relatively interesting time or for military operations, for more longer strikes of drones and more precision to be achieved in terms of strikes. But it's not going to apparently lead anywhere in that sense. That is not my calculation that this is going to make any big difference. As you mentioned, it may not be as bad as quagmire, but it's not going to transform that stalemate into anything breakthrough for either side, pushing for any clear gains for either Moscow or Kyiv.
Okay, Adya, my question is, Russia is a superior military power. You know, with the sort of attacks that are taking place and at the cost of Putin's reputation, because he can't afford to lose war, the sort of attack that the Russians can do, they have not done in Ukraine. Why?
I think, see, firstly, there's also been a lot of international pressure on Russia. Russia's come under a lot of scrutiny, sanctions, all of that. So I think on one hand, there's that. Second of all, I think, as the war drags on, both the economic and political costs of fighting the war continue to pile up. And as that adds up, that also adds pressure on Russia. In terms of the kinds of attacks, I think it's interesting to see how this particular form of attack that Ukraine has decided to launch against Russia. Because earlier in the war, Russia was launching these barrages of drones towards Ukraine, and the logic behind that was that the economic costs of intercepting the drones end up being much higher than the cost of launching the drones. So you're overwhelming enemy air defenses. And I think it's interesting to see how Ukraine has done that. And as the range of the systems that they've been developing has gone up, and as they're able to hit Moscow, I think it's very interesting to see, because hitting Moscow isn't just, first of all, there's Putin's reputation, as you said, and there's the optics of hitting Moscow, which is downright embarrassing for Russia, and then it raises all sorts of questions about Russia's air defenses. But secondly, they've been hitting civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure, and I from somewhere I read that uh, in Crimea now, then there's like a major disruptions in Russian fuel supply, and I think though this may not end the war, as Professor said, it adds pressure. It adds pressure on fronts that people can see more clearly, because otherwise, for people sitting in Moscow, a lot of it is, this is a distant war, and I think both in terms of optics and actual costs, this can change things a little bit.
Okay, Professor Swaran Singh, one is that yes, it's very difficult to combat a drone attack, but it's very easy to organize one. So the optics are there. But how long can Putin afford to be in this war? Whenever the czars have lost wars, they have lost their chair also. Putin is the modern czar. If I'm not exaggerating, he's the modern czar, a leader forever. How long can he afford to have these visuals on air, where he seems to be getting it back from the Ukrainians?
That's definitely an important point, because the mention of political costs is interesting. And in one after another wars throughout history, we have noticed that even when a particular nation may have enormous capability to destroy its enemy, there is an optimal level beyond which the political costs outweigh the military strikes. In that sense, we have noticed what has happened in Iran, US war also, or all wars that United States fought against nations that were far weaker compared to United States military capacity. So there is an optimal level beyond which no nation can really use military strikes. Nagasaki, Hiroshima were exceptions, because that was after 6 years of World War, when the world believed that this war will never end, and therefore atomic attacks in that sense were justified. Even then, there were kind of criticism. But definitely, the political costs are going to
Actually, you
rise
said the most important
increasingly.
thing.
But
That's
we
where I
have
wanted to
noticed.
drive the conversation, that unlike Americans, what they did in the World War, obviously no one is going to use a nuclear bomb, that they chose to force close a war, because they knew that the war will take place for another 2 years, and this couldn't afford it. Why aren't Russians opting for that option from a non-nuclear perspective? There are multiple ways in which they can actually end the war.
Two very quick things explain that. One, as you mentioned yourself, President Vladimir Putin is almost like a Russian czar. He has brutally handled opposition in his own country, has managed to stay in power so long. So we don't know if any underground movement unknown is going to erupt, which looks less possibility. And second, Ukraine is on Russian borders, so it's not a faraway war like United States was fighting in Korea or in Afghanistan or in other places. It's a war on its own borders, and therefore also former part of Soviet Union territory. So in that sense, it has that comfort of it's not having logistical problems of flying over longer distances or deploying forces at a faraway place. So it can endure relatively longer. But we will notice again, as you mentioned, the upsurge is being spoken of today, and we are saying that this is a stronger upsurge than anything that happened beyond initial couple of weeks of this war in February to April 2022. So these surges will go up and down, and in that sense, that stalemate more or less will continue, and increasingly we will see, these periods when such surges may happen, and then finally, I normally believe wars have usually ended in exhaustion, stalemate in terms of fatigue, and that is where the whole orchestration of diplomatic negotiation sometimes is presented as a facade. So we could see something like that ultimately. I don't know when. It doesn't appear to be anywhere near right now. But the fact that Iranian war is kind of coming to the negotiation table could also be one way of attracting attention, and both sides would be attracting that attention from global powers as to whether they want to intervene and push either side or the other side onto the negotiation table. That could also be a kind of a motive right now. But otherwise, this is going to be kind of occasional upsurges that
You know
both sides can afford.
what
Ukraine's
what I find so very interesting, Adya, to you is that the American and Israeli responses to the acts of terrorism has been very disproportionate. If you look at the heinous act of terrorism carried by Al Qaeda in America, had a disproportionate response. 1,700 innocent people were killed by Hamas, but it led to a disproportionate response by Israel. They have ended up destabilizing entire West Asia. Russian, in terms of response, is not disproportionate. You know, if you look at the, I'm sorry to use the word symmetry of war, the responses are proportionate. They might be threatening, each other, but responses are always proportionate, and that's what I find fascinating in this Ukrainian theater. And I really don't know what's the reason for that.
I feel like part of it is also that Russia can afford to drag on this war for a really long time. And yes, now we're seeing that, their military machine is perhaps seeming a little tired. There's questions about whether they're able to produce things like interceptors as fast as they need them. But so far, because Russia has been able to carry this on this war for a long time, and I think the understanding when the war first started was that Russia is obviously going to be able to last much longer and sustain this conflict much longer than Ukraine, which is why I think it's easier for Russia to have to do that without having a response that may seem disproportionate or even more escalatory, because then they can also have the moral high ground of saying, okay, we haven't escalated this conflict further, we haven't taken any what may be understood as overtly drastic action, while also dragging it on and on and on in the hope that Ukraine's military infrastructure just won't be able to keep pace with the war.
It's so surprising. Professor Swaran Singh, such an attack from an outside power inside Russia is the first ever after the Second World War. There have been terror attacks by the Chechens, but there have been no such attack from the Americans or the NATO. This is first time the attack has taken place, and that too, which is supposed to be their spiritual and cultural fountain of the so-called Russianness. I find this immensely fascinating that this fight deep inside Russia is emanating, which they described as their own.
historically, whether it was Tsarist Russia, Soviet Russia, or Russian Federation, the strategic thinking behind keeping buffers against the Western European nations was trust that territory is security for them. And they thought Moscow was really far away for any Western nation to try and hit. And that is being, defied now with the cheaper technological transformations where drones are reaching as far as 1200 kilometers or more,
Yes.
and are able to still try and hit with precision. And that is transforming the way war is being fought. And the asymmetry, which you mentioned in terms of symmetry of deaths, is turning into symmetry in that sense. And both sides are able to constantly, continue to at least create panic for each other, and then of course they will slow down for a certain period of time, and they might come back again with another surge. But the technological transformation has made it today possible for Ukraine to go as far as Moscow, or hit Crimea, or hit other places. Moscow's, I think, southern and eastern residential areas were also evacuated. That creates enormous panic for
Can
millions of
Trump,
people
can,
as to
can like
which
Trump,
way the
Putin sir
great.
can go for an off ramp? I need to close the show. Can Putin go for an off ramp?
I find it difficult because Putin is far more calculative. He's not kind of he's not whimsical or instinctive in that sense.
Okay.
So he uses far more calculus before he takes any decision.
Far more calculated. Adya, do you agree with Professor Swaran Singh?
I do feel like he's far more calculated, but also I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if he were to take decisions that didn't come across as calculated. Because we've seen with Israel, we've seen with the United States, the things that may come across as very questionable and bizarre decisions on the face of it, have been accepted to a certain extent, and these are leaders who are still in power.
What can be more bizarre than the fact that today, if US had won the war, Arakchi was the one who was snubbing JD Vance. He was the one who moved out of the room. And I was thinking during my editorial meeting, if the America had won the war, how come Iranians are snubbing the Americans and leaving the venue? But that is the so-called irony, and that is the truth of the West Asian theatre, that actually the Americans got the hard end of the stick. Thank you so much, Professor Swaran Singh. Thank you so much, Adya, for joining me.